Long before Scandinavian ships appeared on foreign shores, the forces shaping them were already at work at home. Between approximately 600 and 800 CE, Scandinavia was defined by environmental constraint rather than abundance. The regions that would later produce Viking expansion, modern Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, were characterized by limited arable land, short growing seasons, and highly variable local conditions. Mountainous terrain dominated Norway, while dense forests and rocky soils restricted large-scale agriculture across much of Sweden. Even in Denmark, where farmland was comparatively more accessible, productivity depended heavily on seasonal stability and labor coordination. These geographic conditions shaped settlement patterns long before overseas movement became visible in historical sources. Archaeological surveys indicate that most Scandinavian communities during this period were small, dispersed, and agriculturally marginal. Farmsteads were typically isolated rather than clustered into dense villages. Excavations at sites such as Borg in Lofoten and Apakra in southern Sweden reveal longhouses functioning as both domestic and economic centers, combining residence, storage, and craft activity under one roof. These structures reflect subsistence strategies designed to maximize limited resources rather than surplus production. Animal husbandry, particularly cattle and sheep, often outweighed crop cultivation, especially in northern and upland regions. The Scandinavian coastline introduced a contrasting environmental feature: extensive access to the sea. Fjords, islands, and shallow coastal waters created natural corridors for movement and resource extraction. Fishing, sealing, and seasonal maritime travel were integrated into subsistence strategies by the early Iron Age. Archaeological evidence from coastal sites shows the consistent use of boats for transport and fishing well before the onset of Viking raiding. These maritime practices were not initially military in nature but developed as adaptations to geography, enabling communication between isolated communities. Climatic conditions during this period further constrained agricultural stability. Paleoclimatic data derived from ice cores and dendrochronology indicates that the lingering effects of the late Antique Little Ice Age, beginning in the 6th century, contributed to cooler temperatures and unpredictable growing seasons across northern Europe. Reduced crop yields and periodic food shortages are reflected indirectly in settlement abandonment patterns and shifts in land use. While Scandinavia did not experience uniform crisis, environmental pressure remained a consistent structural factor shaping social organization. These conditions reinforced social differentiation within Scandinavian communities. Archaeological finds at Apakra reveal a long-occupied central place with evidence of craft specialization, imported goods, and ritual activity. Such sites suggest the emergence of local elites capable of controlling exchange networks and surplus redistribution. However, this stratification developed within a landscape that could not sustain large populations without external resources. Authority was therefore localized and dependent on maintaining access to land, labor, and trade connections. Maritime technology evolved within this context of environmental adaptation. The development of clinker-built boats, constructed with overlapping planks riveted together, appears in archaeological contexts centuries before recorded Viking expeditions. These vessels were light, flexible, and well-suited to both open water and shallow rivers. Their design reflects practical requirements for fishing, transport, and regional travel rather than offensive warfare. Shipbuilding knowledge spread along coastlines and river systems, reinforcing mobility as a normal feature of Scandinavian life. Material evidence from burial contexts further supports this interpretation. Ship burials from the later Viking Age have earlier technological precedents, indicating continuity rather than sudden innovation. The tools associated with woodworking, rope-making, and sail production appear incrementally across the archaeological record. These developments suggest cumulative adaptation to environmental constraints rather than a singular cultural shift toward violence or expansion. Population pressure, while difficult to quantify precisely, appears to have increased modestly during the late Iron Age. Improved agricultural tools, including iron plowshares, marginally expanded usable land. However, gains were uneven and insufficient to eliminate scarcity. Inheritance practices likely fragmented landholdings over generations, further limiting opportunity within established settlements. These structural pressures created incentives for seasonal movement, trade, and eventually permanent relocation. By the late 8th century, Scandinavian societies possessed the technical capacity for long-distance travel, the social experience of maritime mobility, and the environmental motivation to seek resources beyond their immediate regions. These conditions did not produce expansion automatically, but they established the structural framework within which later political and military developments would occur. As geography constrained opportunity, social organization evolved to manage scarcity and competition. Before we continue exploring the forces that shaped early Viking society, take a moment to subscribe to Nightfall History, click the bell icon to receive daily videos, and share in the comments which part of this journey you found most intriguing. Power in early Scandinavia was personal, temporary, and constantly contested. During the period preceding large-scale Viking activity, Scandinavian political structures were highly decentralized. Authority was predominantly local, exercised by chieftains or jarlar, rather than by monarchs with centralized bureaucracies. Chieftains maintained influence primarily through personal relationships, controlling access to land, livestock, and resources. Archaeological evidence, including the longhouse complexes at Lidra in Denmark and Tiso in southern Sweden, demonstrates the material basis of power. Large halls functioned as centers for feasting, judicial assemblies, and the redistribution of surplus. These structures served both domestic and political purposes, reinforcing the jarl's social standing and capacity to mobilize followers. Social and political bonds were sustained through practices of gift exchange and reciprocal obligation. Feasting, ceremonial hosting, and distribution of wealth allowed leaders to assert authority and loyalty among retainers. Written sources, such as later saga material, describe these interactions, while material culture, including imported metalwork and finely crafted tools found at elite sites, corroborates the presence of concentrated wealth. These mechanisms of influence were fluid, highly personalized, and dependent on continued performance. Leadership could shift rapidly due to death, dispute, or loss of support. Scandinavian assemblies, known as ings, provided structured forums for collective decision-making and conflict resolution. These gatherings allowed free men to deliberate on local disputes, codify customary law, and adjudicate property or succession matters. Archaeological and place name evidence indicates that ings were located at prominent natural features, often on ridges or near waterways, emphasizing accessibility for participants from dispersed settlements. Law codes from later periods reflect continuity of these institutions, illustrating that governance relied on consensus and negotiation rather than coercion by central authority. The absence of centralized governance explains why large, coordinated military campaigns did not emerge prior to the 9th century. Warfare was typically organized by small warbands loyal to individual chieftains, often limited to raiding neighboring communities or defending territorial claims. Chronicles and saga accounts suggest that even regional leaders rarely exercised authority over multiple chieftains simultaneously, reinforcing the inherently fragmented nature of Scandinavian politics. This fragmentation constrained the scale of early military expeditions, which were opportunistic rather than systemic. Nevertheless, decentralization allowed for flexibility in coalition building. Seasonal gatherings, intermarriage between elite families, and temporary alliances enabled chieftains to coordinate larger forces when motivated by wealth, prestige, or strategic necessity. Archaeological patterns of trade goods and shared craft styles indicate networks of interaction that extended across regions, providing the social infrastructure for more complex collaboration. These networks would later facilitate the assembly of forces capable of sustained operations abroad, including the campaigns that led to the formation of the Great Heathen Army. Settlement patterns further reinforced political fragmentation. Communities were dispersed across challenging terrain, from Norway's fjord-indented coastlines to Sweden's forested river valleys. Each local leader controlled only a limited territory, constrained by natural boundaries and the productivity of surrounding lands. Environmental pressures, including marginal soils and variable climatic conditions, necessitated that power remain localized. Attempts to centralize authority over wider regions were historically rare and often short-lived. Material culture illustrates the dual role of social and political authority. Large communal halls not only accommodated feasting but also served as storage for surplus grain, livestock, and tools, consolidating both economic and symbolic power. Excavations at Lidra reveal evidence of craft production, ritual deposits, and imported luxury items, suggesting that elite influence was exercised through control of both tangible resources and ceremonial practice. These findings align with textual accounts in which leaders are depicted as redistributors of wealth and arbiters of justice. By the late 8th century, Scandinavian political life remained highly individualized and fragmented. Chieftains operated within overlapping spheres of influence, dependent on loyalty and reputation rather than formal office. The combination of local authority, dispersed settlement, and weak central structures meant that large-scale, sustained military campaigns were logistically impossible. At the same time, the social and political infrastructure was sufficiently robust to allow for temporary alliances, creating the potential for larger coalitions when opportunity arose. Political fragmentation, therefore, was not simply a constraint. It was a defining characteristic of early Scandinavian society. It provided the framework within which wealth, status, and reputation were contested, and it established the conditions necessary for later outward expansion. The absence of centralized power encouraged leaders to seek resources beyond local territory, ultimately setting the stage for the coalitions and mobilizations that would characterize Viking campaigns in the 9th century. By the end of this period, Scandinavian society was poised at a critical juncture. Internally fragmented, yet capable of temporary cooperation, it was ready for the transition from local warbands to coordinated, multi-regional forces. The structural realities of politics and power in early Scandinavia thus directly influenced the emergence of the Viking expansion that would follow. The first Viking attacks were brief, brutal, and deliberately limited. The earliest recorded Viking activity in Western Europe is commonly traced to the attack on the Lindisfarne monastery in 793 CE. Contemporary accounts, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, describe the sudden arrival of raiders along the Northumbrian coast, emphasizing the destruction of property, the killing of monks, and the seizure of wealth. These raids were characterized by their brevity and targeted nature. Rather than representing sustained occupation, they were tactical strikes aimed at concentrated sources of wealth with minimal risk to the attackers. Frankish annals corroborate this pattern, noting small bands of raiders attacking coastal settlements in Francia, often retreating before local militias could respond. Irish annals provide further evidence of regional variation in raiding strategy. Monasteries such as Iona and Inishbofin were repeatedly attacked during the late 8th and early 9th centuries. These sources emphasize accessibility, stored wealth, and the relative absence of defensive structures as primary reasons for selection. Contemporary observers occasionally interpreted these attacks in religious terms, portraying the Vikings as hostile to Christian institutions. However, the targeting appears to have been pragmatic. Economic concentration, not theological opposition, determined the focus of early raids. Logistical preparation was a critical component of these operations. Viking raiding parties relied on small, highly mobile ships capable of navigating both open seas and shallow rivers. Archaeological evidence from sites in Denmark and Norway, including clinker-built vessels found in burial contexts, demonstrates the technological capability to transport men and supplies efficiently. River systems such as the Loire, Seine, and Humber allowed raiders to penetrate inland, attack vulnerable settlements, and retreat rapidly. The ability to exploit these waterways marked a significant evolution in operational planning compared to contemporary raiding elsewhere in Europe. Overwintering remained rare in this early period, though indications exist of temporary encampments in Ireland and along the Frankish coast. These short-term bases allowed raiders to maintain presence in hostile territory for extended periods without committing to permanent settlement. Chroniclers note that supplies were often procured locally or brought along in small quantities, limiting the scale of operations. This reliance on local acquisition demonstrates both the adaptability and the constraints of early Viking raiding methodology. Coordination between raiding parties was generally limited. Early raids typically involved small bands under the command of individual chieftains, with minimal centralized leadership. Success depended on speed, surprise, and intelligence gathering. Anglo-Saxon and Frankish sources repeatedly comment on the efficiency of these mobile forces, noting their ability to strike settlements that were otherwise secure from internal conflict. Raiders often used prior reconnaissance or information obtained from coastal populations to identify optimal targets, highlighting the role of intelligence in operational planning. The early raids also reveal an adaptive learning process. Viking bands adjusted routes, timing, and targets based on experience. Irish sources, for example, document the repeated movement of raiders between islands and mainland sites, suggesting an understanding of local defensive patterns. Similarly, the Frankish annals describe successive attacks along the Seine and lore that incorporated lessons from previous encounters, including methods to avoid fortified positions and exploit riverine navigation. These incremental adjustments laid the groundwork for later campaigns of extended duration and greater complexity. Despite their effectiveness, these raids exposed the limitations of seasonal hit-and-run warfare. Small forces could seize wealth but could not maintain long-term control or extract broader political advantage. The success of early raids created expectations among both attackers and targets, prompting coastal populations to enhance defenses and adapt their response strategies. This interplay between raiders and defenders would eventually motivate the transition from opportunistic strikes to organized campaigns capable of sustained presence. By the end of the first decades of Viking activity, patterns of mobility, target selection, and logistical organization were firmly established. Raiding remained brief and economically oriented, exploiting vulnerabilities in Western Europe's coastal and riverine settlements. The combination of small, agile forces with practical navigational skill enabled consistent success, while limitations in manpower and centralized coordination prevented permanent occupation. These early raids provided the experiential and structural foundation for the transition to more sustained campaigns that would characterize Viking strategy in the mid-9th century and beyond. The Viking ship was not merely a vessel, it was a strategic system. The technological foundations of Viking mobility rested primarily on their distinctive ship designs. Archaeological discoveries at Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway provide the most complete examples of these vessels, dating from the 9th century. Both ships were clinker-built, a method in which overlapping planks were riveted together, producing a lightweight but structurally robust hull. This design permitted flexibility on rough seas, shallow riverine channels, and narrow inlets. The hull's shallow drafts allowed navigation in waters that would have been inaccessible to larger continental ships, while simultaneously enabling sufficient stability for open ocean crossings. The dimensions and construction of these vessels illustrate their operational versatility. The Gokstad ship measured approximately 23 meters in length and could carry a crew of up to 32 rowers, with additional space for passengers and cargo. The combination of oars and a square sail allowed for propulsion under varying wind conditions, giving raiding parties both speed and maneuverability. Archaeologists have noted the careful balance between cargo capacity and crew size, which permitted raiding bands to carry provisions for extended campaigns without overloading the vessel. These logistical considerations highlight the ship's role not merely as transportation, but as a system enabling strategic flexibility. Material analysis of these ships demonstrates a level of craftsmanship optimized for endurance. Oak timbers, carefully shaped and fastened with iron rivets, provided resilience against both mechanical stress and prolonged exposure to water. The presence of steering oars and rudimentary keels enhanced navigational control, particularly in coastal and riverine environments. Experimental reconstructions of the Gokstad ship confirm that such vessels could travel several hundred kilometers in a day under favorable conditions, supporting the rapid redeployment necessary for hit-and-run raids or coordinated assaults across dispersed targets. Ship design also had direct implications for military strategy. Mobility enabled raiders to strike unexpectedly, circumvent fortified positions, and withdraw before facing sustained counterattack. The strategic value of this mobility is evident in early raids along the Seine, Loire, and Humber, where rivers provided corridors deep into interior regions. Sources from the Frankish annals describe Viking parties appearing inland within days of landing, highlighting the operational advantage conferred by these vessels. By combining speed, maneuverability, and capacity, the ships acted as force multipliers, extending the reach of relatively small numbers of warriors. The ability to transport troops and supplies efficiently transformed the scale and nature of campaigns. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites in Ireland and England, such as Dublin and Repton, indicates that ships carried not only raiding parties but also horses, livestock, and provisions. This capability allowed for overwintering and temporary occupation, marking a shift from seasonal raids to sustained operations. The combination of mobility and logistical planning meant that larger forces could operate simultaneously across multiple theaters, a level of coordination impossible without advanced ship technology. Coastal and riverine networks further amplified the strategic advantages of Viking ships. Fjords, estuaries, and inland waterways served as natural highways, facilitating movement between targets and enabling the concentration of forces at critical points. Contemporary sources, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Irish Annals, frequently note Viking forces appearing in locations thought to be inaccessible, underscoring the operational reach conferred by maritime infrastructure. Ship design, combined with local environmental knowledge, allowed raiders to maintain the initiative and dictate the tempo of conflict. The integration of naval technology into military planning reflects a sophisticated understanding of logistics and terrain. Unlike static fortifications or infantry-based armies, Viking raiding parties leveraged mobility to mitigate numerical inferiority. Coordination between vessels enabled simultaneous attacks or feigned maneuvers, and the flexibility of deployment permitted rapid withdrawal when confronted with superior forces. The ship, therefore, was central to operational doctrine, not simply a tool of transport. By the early 9th century, Scandinavian communities had developed a naval infrastructure capable of supporting increasingly ambitious campaigns. This included not only the construction of clinker-built vessels, but also the organization of crews, maintenance of provisions, and knowledge of seasonal wind and tidal patterns. Such capabilities provided the material basis for the transition from opportunistic raids to sustained campaigns with broader strategic objectives. As mobility improved, military objectives expanded. The operational range, logistical capacity, and speed of the Viking fleet enabled raiders to penetrate deeper into Western Europe, engage in more complex campaigns, and sustain longer occupations. The ship's design and deployment underpinned the evolution of Viking warfare, demonstrating that technological innovation was a prerequisite for the expansionary strategies that would characterize the mid-9th century and later periods. The name itself tells us as much about fear as it does about fact. The historical term Great Heathen Army originates from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a series of annals compiled in the late 9th century. The original Old English phrase, Meiselheer, is often translated as Great Army or Mighty Host. Linguistic analysis, however, reveals ambiguity. The term could signify either numerical size, organizational significance, or simply a force of notable threat. This ambiguity requires careful consideration when interpreting contemporary records, as chroniclers frequently employed evaluative language influenced by perceived danger rather than empirical data. Comparative textual analysis strengthens this critical perspective. Frankish annals and Irish chronicles from the same period report Viking activity with less emphasis on grandeur, often describing multiple, smaller raiding parties operating simultaneously. For example, the Annals Bertiniani note Scandinavian incursions along the Seine and Loire without specifying a singular, unified force of comparable scale to that implied in the Anglo-Saxon narrative. Irish sources such as the Annals of Ulster frequently distinguish between different warbands, suggesting that early English observers may have aggregated these groups into a single entity for rhetorical effect. Estimates of the army's size are difficult to verify. Later medieval sources suggest numbers in the thousands, but these figures are likely exaggerated. Archaeological evidence, including settlement patterns, burial sites, and temporary encampments, implies that Viking forces were substantial yet logistically constrained. The capacity of ships such as those reconstructed from the Gokstad and Oseberg finds indicates that a single expedition could transport only a limited number of warriors along with provisions. Consequently, modern scholars approach population estimates cautiously, emphasizing operational coordination and the collective impact of multiple bands over absolute troop counts. The methodological approach to understanding the Great Heathen Army therefore prioritizes structure and coordination rather than raw numbers. Contemporary records consistently describe the army as moving with strategy, overwintering in East Anglia, and launching coordinated campaigns across Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex. This suggests that chroniclers were aware of an emergent capacity for sustained operations, rather than merely reacting to isolated raids. Evaluating sources in this way allows historians to distinguish between rhetorical amplification and observable historical phenomena. Critical engagement with source material also highlights regional perspectives. Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, writing under the threat of invasion, emphasized the magnitude and menace of the army to underscore political vulnerability. Continental sources, less directly affected, provide a contrasting view, documenting raiding parties' movement and economic impact without the same apocalyptic tone. Cross-referencing these accounts reveals a nuanced picture. The army was formidable in coordination and impact, but its size was likely smaller than early sources implied. The term here, or army, in Old English conveys more than physical presence. It encompasses organizational capacity and mobilization potential. Legal codes and military obligations from the period indicate that mobilization of FYRD forces was contingent on local leadership and seasonal availability, meaning that even substantial Viking forces relied on strategic deployment rather than sheer numbers. Contemporary understanding of the term therefore reflects both the chronicler's perception and the underlying military reality. Archaeological findings, such as the traces of winter encampments in East Anglia and along river systems, corroborate textual analysis. The spatial distribution and size of these sites suggest a degree of logistical sophistication necessary to sustain a large body of warriors over months, supporting the idea that the Mysil here functioned as a coordinated force rather than a loosely connected series of raiding parties. Material evidence thus confirms strategic intent while moderating the more extreme numerical claims of the written sources. By establishing the precise meaning and context of terminology, historians create a rigorous foundation for subsequent analysis. Understanding Mysil here in both linguistic and operational terms allows for a clearer reconstruction of the army's composition, leadership, and campaign strategy. This critical framework mitigates reliance on potentially exaggerated contemporary reports and situates the Great Heathen Army within a verifiable historical and logistical context. With terminology clarified, attention can turn to the composition of the force itself. The following sections examine leadership structures, the coalition of warbands, and the strategic organization that enabled the army to operate effectively across multiple Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, setting the stage for sustained military campaigns in the mid-9th century. This was not a single army, but many bound by opportunity. The leadership of the Great Heathen Army has long been associated with figures such as Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba. Contemporary sources, primarily the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the fragmentary Annals of Ireland, record these individuals as prominent in campaigns across Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. However, historical analysis requires careful separation of probable fact from later legendary accretions. Saga material, composed centuries after the events, often conflates heroic narrative with historical memory. Modern scholarship emphasizes the likelihood that these leaders were coordinators of multiple semi-independent warbands rather than commanders of a single monolithic force. Coalition leadership characterized the army's organizational structure. Individual chieftains retained authority over their own retinues, yet coordinated action was necessary to achieve strategic objectives. This required negotiation, temporary alliances, and compromise. Charters and annals suggest that major campaigns, such as the capture of York in 866, were undertaken with combined forces, indicating an operational consensus among leaders. Each warband contributed manpower, logistical support, and regional knowledge, creating a composite army capable of sustained activity across disparate territories. Scandinavian dynastic rivalries played a central role in motivating participation. Exiled or marginalized members of ruling families sought wealth, prestige, or revenge in foreign campaigns. Ivar the Boneless, for instance, is frequently described as operating in collaboration with other kinsmen, leveraging familial networks to assemble forces. Archaeological evidence, including burial mounds in the Viking homelands, demonstrates that prominent individuals often had both the resources and status to mobilize men for overseas expeditions. Such mobilization relied on reputation, kinship, and strategic opportunity rather than formalized military hierarchy. The absence of centralized command had significant operational implications. While the army could coordinate assaults, logistics, and winter quarters, decision-making remained distributed. Each warband was capable of independent action if necessary, facilitating flexibility but also requiring ongoing negotiation among leaders. Contemporary accounts describe meetings at encampments, such as those in East Anglia, where leadership disputes were resolved and objectives clarified. These gatherings functioned as strategic councils, balancing autonomy with collective purpose. Political exile and interdynastic competition extended beyond Scandinavia into the context of Viking operations in England. Leaders displaced by domestic conflict often sought recompense or consolidation of power abroad. By combining forces with other exiled or ambitious figures, they could achieve scale and influence unattainable in their homeland. This dynamic explains both the rapid assembly of the army and the diversity of its leadership composition, reflecting the interplay between personal ambition and collective strategy. The coalition model also influenced campaign planning. Leaders coordinated routes of attack, seasonal movement, and target selection to maximize impact while minimizing risk. Anglo-Saxon sources emphasize the effectiveness of these arrangements, particularly in the coordinated overrunning of Northumbrian and Mercian territories. Logistics, including the movement of supplies, horses, and reinforcements, were shared responsibilities, reflecting both the practical and political dimensions of leadership. The army structure allowed multiple leaders to maintain status and retain followers while contributing to a larger operational objective. Archaeological evidence supports the presence of decentralized yet coordinated forces. Temporary encampments in East Anglia, characterized by organized layouts and indications of long-term occupation, suggest the simultaneous presence of multiple warbands. The distribution of high-status objects, weapons, and domestic artifacts within these sites implies differentiated leadership and functional specialization, consistent with historical accounts of coalition command. These material patterns indicate that the army's effectiveness derived not from singular authority but from collaborative organization. Contemporary narrative sources and material evidence together suggest that the Great Heathen Army operated as a strategic coalition. Leaders exercised authority through negotiation, kinship networks, and shared operational planning rather than through centralized hierarchy. The interplay between ambition, exile politics, and the practical necessities of extended campaigning shaped the army's capacity to project power across multiple Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Coordination among semi-autonomous leaders enabled complex maneuvers that would have been impossible for isolated bands or singularly commanded forces. By maintaining cohesion across multiple warbands, leadership created a force capable of sustained engagement, resource extraction, and territorial control. This coalition structure laid the foundation for strategic deployment in England, allowing the army to operate effectively over extended periods and across multiple regions. The combination of autonomous authority with cooperative strategy defined the organizational character of the Great Heathen Army and prepared it for the campaigns that followed in Northumbria, Mercia, and beyond. England in the 9th century was politically divided long before it was invaded. By the mid-9th century, the political landscape of Anglo-Saxon England was defined by fragmentation among 7 principal kingdoms, collectively known as the Heptarchy: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, Kent, Sussex, and Essex. Each kingdom operated with considerable autonomy, maintaining its own monarchy, legal codes, and military forces. Charters and regnal lists, alongside entries in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, illustrate frequent dynastic turnover, shifting alliances, and internal rivalries. These structural dynamics weakened the possibility of coordinated defense against external threats, leaving the region vulnerable to opportunistic raiding or larger-scale invasion. Northumbria exemplified the instability characteristic of the period. Following the death of King Athelred in the early 9th century, a civil war ensued between Aella and Osbert, fragmenting royal authority and diminishing administrative coherence. The chronicle records that these disputes undermined military readiness, leaving the northern kingdom unable to present a unified response to external threats. Archaeological evidence, including limited fortification investment along key riverine approaches, supports the interpretation that Northumbria's political turmoil had tangible consequences for defense and territorial control. Mercia's decline provides a complementary case study. Once a dominant power under Offa in the late 8th century, Mercia experienced significant succession instability following his death in 796 CE. Charters indicate frequent changes in leadership and contested royal appointments, reflecting both internal factionalism and challenges to territorial authority. This instability constrained Mercia's capacity to maintain sustained military campaigns or coordinate with neighboring kingdoms. Although Mercia retained some administrative cohesion, its weakened position shifted the balance of power in southern and central England, leaving it more vulnerable to incursions from the north and east. East Anglia, Kent, Sussex, and Essex were generally smaller and less militarily organized. These kingdoms relied on local magnates and FYRD levies for defense, lacking permanent standing forces. Their relative weakness made them dependent on alliances with more powerful neighbors, but these alliances were frequently short-lived or subject to disruption by succession disputes. Entries in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle document a pattern of local rulers paying tribute to Viking raiders, illustrating both the limitations of regional military capacity and the consequences of fragmented political authority. Wessex emerged as one of the more stable kingdoms during this period. Nevertheless, even Wessex's authority was constrained by geographic barriers and decentralized administration. Control over outlying regions required negotiation with local elites, and levies for military campaigns were limited by seasonal agricultural demands. Legal codes and administrative charters indicate that royal power depended on coordination with landed aristocracy rather than direct enforcement, reinforcing the broader pattern of decentralized governance across England. The heptarchy's fragmentation also affected coordination among kingdoms. Alliances were often reactive, negotiated in response to immediate threats rather than sustained strategic planning. Evidence from charters and treaty documents demonstrates that inter-kingdom cooperation was episodic and fragile. Joint military action, when it occurred, depended on ad hoc negotiation and the ability of rulers to mobilize local militias within a constrained timeframe. The absence of standing institutions to integrate these forces limited operational efficiency and reinforced the vulnerability of the region. Religious institutions intersected with political dynamics, both concentrating wealth and influencing alliances. Monasteries and cathedral centers were major landholders and acted as centers of administration. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle frequently notes their involvement in provisioning and supporting local levies, highlighting the integration of ecclesiastical structures into governance. However, reliance on such institutions also meant that disruption, whether through internal conflict or raiding, could destabilize local authority. By the mid-9th century, the structural weaknesses of the heptarchy, fragmented kingdoms, contested succession, and inconsistent alliances created a landscape in which even a relatively small, organized external force could exploit political and military gaps. Northumbria's internal conflict, Mercia's declining hegemony, and the limited military capacity of smaller kingdoms all illustrate the systemic vulnerabilities inherent in decentralized governance. These vulnerabilities were compounded by geographic barriers, logistical limitations, and the seasonal nature of levy mobilization, which together restricted the ability to coordinate a unified defensive response. Political fragmentation was mirrored by uneven military capacity across the region. While individual kingdoms maintained localized defensive structures and levies, there was no overarching command capable of integrating these forces into a coordinated strategic plan. This institutional context set the stage for the arrival of external forces, highlighting how structural conditions, rather than purely leadership failure, shaped the vulnerability of Anglo-Saxon England in the decades preceding the Great Heathen Army's campaigns. England's armies were built for local wars, not prolonged invasions. Anglo-Saxon military organization in the mid-9th century was structured primarily around the FYRD, a levy of free men obligated to serve under their local lord or king for limited periods. Law codes, including the West Saxon laws of Ione and later Mercian regulations, detail the responsibilities of freeholders to provide arms, provisions, and service for a specified number of days each year. Service was often contingent upon agricultural cycles, as most levied men were farmers whose participation could not significantly disrupt essential subsistence activities. The seasonal and ad hoc nature of the FYRD limited both training and cohesion, making these forces effective for local skirmishes or short-term defensive operations, but ill-prepared for sustained or highly mobile campaigns. Royal retinues and household troops supplemented the FYRD, providing a professional corps of warriors under direct command of the king or alderman. These forces were comparatively small and concentrated around key political centers. Archaeological evidence, including high-status weapon deposits and fortified hall complexes, indicates that kings maintained elite contingents capable of rapid deployment within their immediate territories. However, these professional units were insufficient to project power beyond regional borders without support from the broader FYRD, constraining strategic flexibility. Fortifications in Anglo-Saxon England were embryonic during this period. While hill forts, ramparts, and river-crossing defenses existed, there was no systematic network of strongholds capable of impeding coordinated external incursions. But construction, which would later be codified under Alfred the Great, was in its preliminary stages. Early defensive works were primarily localized and designed for protection against raiders or rival neighbors rather than professional armies. Excavations at sites such as York and Lincoln reveal isolated fortifications, but these lacked integration into a cohesive defensive strategy capable of countering mobile forces like the Viking army. The absence of coordinated naval defense further compounded vulnerability. Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had limited maritime capacity, relying primarily on small, locally constructed vessels for transportation or river patrols. Chroniclers note that Viking forces frequently navigated inland rivers, exploiting gaps in coastal and fluvial surveillance. The inability to control maritime approaches meant that raiding parties could bypass heavily defended settlements and strike targets of opportunity with minimal resistance. This structural deficiency contrasted sharply with Viking reliance on ships optimized for both open sea and shallow river travel. Comparative analysis with Carolingian military systems demonstrates the limitations inherent in the Anglo-Saxon model. While Carolingian forces occasionally employed standing contingents supplemented by levies with formal training, Anglo-Saxon levies were seasonal, decentralized, and dependent on personal obligation rather than codified mobilization. These institutional constraints reduced operational effectiveness, particularly when facing an adversary capable of extended campaigning and rapid redeployment. The practical consequences of these limitations are evident in historical accounts. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that initial Viking incursions encountered sporadic resistance, often localized to individual settlements or royal centers. Defensive action was reactive rather than preemptive, constrained by the capacity of regional levies and the slow mobilization of forces from distant territories. Even the more organized kingdoms, such as Wessex, struggled to assemble sufficient manpower to challenge raiders operating simultaneously in multiple regions. Moreover, reliance on local militias shaped tactical expectations. Anglo-Saxon forces were accustomed to defending fixed positions or conducting limited expeditions, not pursuing highly mobile, coordinated raiding parties. The structural design of military obligation, training, and provisioning therefore predisposed the kingdoms to vulnerability against forces operating continuously and strategically, rather than episodically. By the mid-9th century, England's military systems were adequate for internal power disputes and small-scale conflicts but ill-suited for defending against professional, adaptive, and mobile armies. The combination of seasonal levies, limited training, fragmented fortifications, and absence of naval coordination created a structural gap that external forces could exploit. This institutional framework directly influenced the patterns of Viking targeting, as raiders sought monasteries, towns, and regions where local defenses could be circumvented or overwhelmed. The invasion began with patience, not battle. In 865 CE, the forces historically identified as the Great Heathen Army made landfall in East Anglia, selecting a region that offered strategic advantage through both geography and political circumstance. East Anglia at this time was characterized by limited centralized authority and relatively open terrain, with lowland river valleys and accessible coasts facilitating movement and supply. Contemporary accounts, primarily the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, note that the army was welcomed temporarily or unopposed in certain areas, reflecting both the kingdom's limited capacity for defense and the pragmatic decisions of local rulers. The army's initial operations emphasized consolidation rather than immediate aggression. One of the earliest recorded actions was the extraction of tribute, which provided both material resources and political leverage. Chronicle entries indicate that this included payments in silver and other portable wealth, serving as both a revenue source and a demonstration of control. Tribute collection also reinforced relationships with local elites who were unable to mount effective resistance, ensuring relative stability within the occupied region and reducing the likelihood of local rebellion during subsequent campaigns. Horse acquisition is another key element of early strategy. The Chronicle highlights the purchase or seizure of horses from East Anglian settlements, reflecting the army's operational priorities. Horses facilitated greater mobility, enabling raiding parties to cover longer distances inland, respond to threats rapidly, and consolidate control over dispersed targets. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavian settlements and contemporaneous European contexts suggests that cavalry, while limited, augmented infantry mobility and logistics, enhancing the army's strategic options during both short-term raids and extended operations. The army's decision to establish a base in East Anglia illustrates deliberate logistical planning. The region's rivers, marshes, and open plains provided natural avenues for transportation and encampment, allowing for secure staging areas from which further campaigns could be launched. Temporary winter camps, supported by archaeological parallels elsewhere, indicate that the army had the capacity to maintain forces for months without immediate reliance on resupply from home territories. These encampments functioned as operational centers, facilitating coordination among multiple warbands and enabling resource management prior to major offensives. East Anglia's political fragmentation also played a critical role in strategic calculation. The kingdom lacked a strong centralized military structure, and local rulers were constrained in their ability to mobilize forces beyond limited militias. This structural weakness allowed the Viking army to extract tribute and organize logistics without engaging in immediate large-scale combat. Coordination among the various components of the army was crucial during this phase, ensuring that resources were allocated efficiently and that multiple units could operate in concert without internal conflict. The methodical approach taken in East Anglia contrasts with popular perceptions of Viking invasions as sudden and exclusively violent. Contemporary sources and logistical analysis suggest a deliberate prioritization of strategic objectives, including securing provisions, acquiring mounts, and establishing temporary control. This preparation allowed the army to operate effectively in subsequent campaigns, particularly in Northumbria and Mercia, where both political complexity and resistance posed greater challenges. In addition to material consolidation, the army's presence in East Anglia served a signaling function. By demonstrating capacity for sustained occupation and organized resource extraction, the forces projected power that extended beyond immediate territorial gains. Neighboring kingdoms, observing the army's discipline and logistical acumen, faced both psychological and practical pressure, influencing responses in regions such as Northumbria and Wessex. By the conclusion of the initial occupation, the Great Heathen Army had established a secure operational foothold, acquired essential resources, and coordinated its dispersed warbands. This period of consolidation reflects a strategic emphasis on preparation over immediate conquest, enabling the army to launch more complex and sustained campaigns in northern England. The emphasis on logistical planning, tribute extraction, and horse procurement illustrates that the army's success depended as much on operational foresight as on battlefield engagement. Northumbria collapsed before it could unite. In 866 CE, the Great Heathen Army advanced into Northumbria, a kingdom already weakened by internal division. At the time, Northumbria was embroiled in a civil conflict between King Aella and Osbert, whose competing claims had fractured royal authority. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the army seized the opportunity presented by this instability, entering the kingdom with minimal initial resistance. Local political fragmentation prevented the coordination of an effective defense, leaving settlements and strategic centers vulnerable to occupation. The capture of York, a principal urban and administrative center, marked the decisive moment of Northumbria's collapse. Archaeological excavations within the city reveal layers of destruction and restructuring consistent with rapid conquest and subsequent occupation. Findings include burned structures, weapon deposits, and signs of reorganization in urban space, all indicative of both military action and strategic consolidation. The army's control of York provided a logistical hub, enabling supply distribution, staging for further operations, and command over surrounding territories. Following the capture of York, both Aella and Osbert were defeated in battle, as recorded in the Chronicle. Their deaths eliminated competing claims to the throne, effectively dismantling existing governance structures. The absence of central authority facilitated the imposition of tribute, reassignment of lands, and establishment of temporary administrative control by the invading forces. By neutralizing both leadership and military capacity, the army created conditions for uninterrupted occupation and positioned itself for subsequent campaigns further south. Northumbria's political vulnerability extended beyond the royal court. Local magnates and urban elites were either co-opted into the new order or temporarily subdued through tribute and presence of armed forces. The army utilized the kingdom's rivers and navigable terrain to project power inland, securing towns and rural areas that might otherwise have offered refuge to opposing forces. This strategic use of geography allowed the Great Heathen Army to consolidate control efficiently, minimizing the duration and cost of resistance. The army's success in Northumbria demonstrates the interplay between opportunistic timing and strategic deployment. Rapid movement from East Anglia, coordination of multiple warbands, and immediate occupation of key urban centers ensured that resistance could not coalesce effectively. Provisioning and logistical preparation acquired in East Anglia enabled sustained operations during this campaign, illustrating the importance of prior consolidation in enabling decisive outcomes. Control of York also had symbolic implications. The city's prominence as a former royal and ecclesiastical center reinforced the army's status and provided a locus of authority in the region. Chronicle entries emphasize the significance of the city's capture, both as a practical advantage and as a demonstration of the army's operational capacity. Subsequent administration relied on the retention of local infrastructure while projecting authority through military presence. By early 867, Northumbria was effectively subdued. The combination of internal division, rapid conquest, and strategic occupation allowed the Great Heathen Army to exploit the kingdom's weaknesses without protracted engagement. The campaign illustrates that the army's effectiveness derived as much from timing, coordination, and control of strategic centers as from battlefield tactics. The collapse of Northumbria provided a template for future operations in other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, where exploitation of political and structural vulnerabilities could yield rapid territorial gains. Conquest gave way to administration. Following years of coordinated campaigns across Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia, the Vikings transitioned from active conquest to the establishment of formal territorial control. Central to this process was the Treaty of Wedmore in 878 CE, traditionally interpreted as an agreement between King Alfred of Wessex and the leaders of the Great Heathen Army. The treaty delineated spheres of influence, establishing a boundary between lands under Anglo-Saxon authority and those under Scandinavian control, which later became known as the Danelaw. While precise terms remain debated, contemporary accounts suggest the recognition of Viking settlement, tribute obligations, and mutual boundaries, reflecting a negotiated settlement after years of sustained military pressure. The Danelaw encompassed substantial portions of northern and eastern England, including Northumbria south of the River Tees, eastern Mercia, and East Anglia. Within these territories, Scandinavian leaders exercised authority over local populations, maintaining their own courts, military contingents, and administrative oversight. Archaeological evidence, including urban planning in York and settlement patterns in Lincolnshire and Norfolk, indicates organized control, with longhouses, workshops, and cemeteries demonstrating continuity of both Scandinavian and indigenous social structures. These physical traces reflect a pragmatic approach, integrating new rulers while relying on existing local institutions for day-to-day governance. Administrative systems under Viking rule combined Scandinavian leadership practices with inherited Anglo-Saxon mechanisms. Local magnates and elites continued to oversee agrarian production, taxation, and legal matters, but Scandinavian officials presided over courts, collected tribute, and resolved disputes involving Viking settlers. Numismatic evidence shows the circulation of both Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian coinage in urban centers, suggesting that economic integration was a priority alongside political control. This hybrid system allowed the Vikings to assert authority efficiently without entirely dismantling established infrastructure. Territorial governance relied on both military oversight and civic administration. The presence of Scandinavian garrisons in strategic settlements ensured rapid response to unrest, while local assemblies, adapted from Anglo-Saxon ings, allowed for dispute resolution and regulation of community affairs. The maintenance of riverine and coastal access routes facilitated trade, provisioning, and the movement of troops, reinforcing both the practical and symbolic dimensions of Viking authority. These administrative mechanisms enabled the Danelaw to remain functional and relatively stable over decades despite ongoing interaction with neighboring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The division of territory also had strategic and symbolic significance. By consolidating control over the north and east, Viking leaders secured resource-rich regions, including arable land, urban centers, and trade hubs. Control of rivers and coastal access ensured both defensive depth and the ability to project power outward when necessary. The careful delineation of boundaries with Wessex and remaining Anglo-Saxon territories reduced the potential for conflict while legitimizing the Viking presence in England, establishing a durable political framework. The transition from conquest to administration highlights the organizational capacity of the Viking leadership. Unlike ephemeral raiding parties, the Great Heathen Army's successors demonstrated sustained oversight, integrating Scandinavian practices with local governance to maintain order, collect tribute, and enforce legal obligations. This period marked the formalization of territorial control, shifting priorities from military expansion to structured governance and resource management. By consolidating authority in the Danelaw, Viking rulers established a system capable of managing both their own settlements and the indigenous population. The blending of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon administrative methods reflects pragmatic adaptation, ensuring compliance, economic productivity, and social stability. This foundation would persist across generations, influencing subsequent interactions with Wessex, Mercia, and other Anglo-Saxon regions. Law became the language of stability. Following the establishment of territorial control in northern and eastern England, Viking leaders confronted the challenge of administering a culturally diverse population. Legal authority was essential not only to maintain order among Scandinavian settlers but also to integrate existing Anglo-Saxon communities. Evidence from later law codes, including the Danelaw laws and adaptations in charters from York, demonstrates a hybrid system in which Scandinavian custom operated alongside inherited Anglo-Saxon legal frameworks. This pluralism allowed Viking rulers to enforce compliance while respecting local traditions, providing both legitimacy and functional governance. Central to this system were assemblies, local councils where freemen and officials convened to settle disputes, regulate economic activity, and adjudicate crimes. These assemblies, derived from Scandinavian practice but adapted to English contexts, served as focal points for legal authority and community participation. Archaeological evidence, such as meeting sites near river crossings and open-air enclosures, supports the notion that these gatherings were structured, recurring, and recognized by both settlers and indigenous populations. Functioning as both judicial and administrative institutions, Ings reinforced the reach of centralized leadership while allowing localized decision-making. Legal pluralism manifested in differentiated treatment for various groups. Scandinavian settlers were subject to customary law emphasizing kinship, compensation, and feuding conventions, while Anglo-Saxon inhabitants remained under traditional local codes, sometimes modified to accommodate Viking overlordship. Written records, including charters and court memoranda, indicate that rulers adjudicated disputes between groups by referencing both systems, balancing fairness with authority. This approach minimized resistance and facilitated the extraction of tribute and fines, while reinforcing the hierarchical structure of the Danelaw. Hybrid legal practice extended to issues of property, inheritance, and trade. Scandinavian leaders respected certain landholding arrangements to ensure continuity of production and loyalty, while simultaneously asserting rights over unclaimed or confiscated resources. Urban centers, particularly York, became sites of codified regulation, governing market activity, trade tolls, and merchant conduct. Numismatic evidence, including coin hoards and standardized weights, indicates administrative oversight consistent with formal legal enforcement. These mechanisms reinforced economic stability while asserting the authority of Viking rulers. Authority under this system relied on a combination of coercion, ritualized recognition, and pragmatic governance. Local assemblies confirmed obligations through public oath-taking, fines, and enforced arbitration, ensuring that compliance was observable and enforceable. Scandinavian leaders delegated responsibilities to trusted lieutenants, who monitored day-to-day adherence to law and mediated conflicts. This network of authority allowed for both flexibility and accountability, maintaining order across diverse and geographically dispersed populations. The integration of law and administration created predictable governance. The hybrid system encouraged settlement by providing security, codifying rights, and regulating obligations. It also enabled rulers to allocate resources efficiently, maintain military readiness, and oversee social relations. By formalizing rules for dispute resolution, property management, and commerce, Viking leaders reduced the potential for local unrest, which could undermine both authority and economic productivity. Legal structures thus became a central instrument of statecraft, reinforcing territorial control and stabilizing newly conquered regions. By the end of the 9th century, the Danelaw had developed a durable legal infrastructure. This framework balanced Scandinavian customs with Anglo-Saxon precedent, established regular assemblies for dispute resolution, and reinforced hierarchical authority. It facilitated peaceful coexistence between settler and indigenous populations, providing both operational stability and social legitimacy. Law in the Danelaw was not merely a tool of coercion but a practical mechanism for managing complex, multi-ethnic territories. Defeat forced reinvention. In 878 CE, King Alfred of Wessex faced a severe crisis following the resurgence of Viking campaigns in southern England. The Great Heathen Army, operating from the Danelaw, launched coordinated assaults that culminated in the temporary collapse of Wessex's defensive posture. Contemporary sources, particularly the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, describe Alfred's retreat to the marshes of Athelney, a strategically secluded location in Somerset. The geography of the Somerset levels provided natural protection, allowing him to evade immediate capture while preserving a nucleus of loyal followers and professional warriors. During this period of enforced exile, Alfred undertook systematic reorganization of both military and administrative structures. He leveraged the small but experienced cohort of household troops remaining with him to maintain security while initiating broader reforms. Historical records suggest that Alfred focused on strengthening local governance, codifying responsibilities for levy service, and ensuring that defensive resources could be mobilized more rapidly. This approach reflected recognition of the structural weaknesses in prior military organization, including reliance on seasonal levies and the absence of integrated fortifications. Fortification planning was a key element of Alfred's reforms. Drawing on both natural terrain and the example of successful Viking encampments, Alfred initiated the construction of a network of fortified settlements, or buzz, strategically located to protect key routes, population centers, and resource nodes. Charters and later chronicles described these buzz as multifunctional centers, capable of hosting garrisons, storing provisions, and serving as administrative hubs. The bus system addressed prior limitations by creating defensible positions that could be rapidly manned by local militias, providing both deterrence and operational flexibility. In addition to fortifications, Alfred focused on military readiness through structural reforms. The organization of the FYRD was adjusted to ensure continuous service and rapid rotation, allowing part of the levy to remain active while others returned to agricultural duties. This created a semi-professional framework that mitigated the vulnerabilities inherent in short-term, seasonal mobilization. The reforms also emphasized coordination among local lords and ealdormen, ensuring that defensive responses could be centralized when necessary without eroding regional autonomy. Administrative reorganization complemented military reforms. Alfred strengthened communication networks, relying on established roads, river routes, and signals to transmit intelligence and orders efficiently. He also codified obligations for tribute, provisioning, and military contribution, using written charters to clarify duties and reduce ambiguity. These measures enhanced operational predictability and facilitated the integration of resources from multiple localities, supporting both defensive and offensive campaigns. Economic stabilization was another critical component. Alfred prioritized the management of food supplies, armament production, and logistical stockpiling within the Buzz. Archaeological evidence from sites indicates storage facilities and infrastructure capable of sustaining populations under siege. This integration of economic planning with military readiness ensured that Wessex could resist protracted pressure from Viking forces, addressing previous limitations observed in the campaigns of 870 to 878. Alfred's approach during exile also extended to social cohesion and legitimacy. By convening councils of local elites and reinforcing the rule of law, he maintained loyalty among both the aristocracy and freemen. Historical sources indicate that these measures strengthened the perception of continuity and authority, even in the absence of full territorial control. Maintaining legitimacy was essential for coordinating collective defense and ensuring compliance with newly established obligations. By the conclusion of Alfred's reorganization in Athelney, Wessex had transitioned from a kingdom vulnerable to rapid incursion into a systemically resilient state. The combination of fortified settlements, semi-professional military structure, administrative clarity, and resource management created conditions for sustained resistance. Alfred's innovations addressed prior structural weaknesses, enabling coordinated response to Viking operations and laying the foundation for eventual counteroffensives. Victory did not end the Vikings. In 878 CE, the confrontation at Edington represented a decisive moment in Alfred of Wessex's systemic resistance against the Viking advance. Contemporary accounts, particularly the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, described the battle as a culmination of strategic preparation following Alfred's reorganization in the marshes of Athelney. Unlike earlier narratives emphasizing total annihilation, modern analysis indicates that the engagement functioned as a method of containment. Alfred's objective was to halt Viking expansion, stabilize Wessex, and create conditions favorable for negotiation, rather than to completely destroy the invading force. The battle itself was preceded by careful logistical positioning and mobilization. Alfred utilized his network of Buzz to assemble a coordinated force, combining semi-professional household troops with locally levied militias. Geographic selection for the engagement leveraged terrain features, including the surrounding hills and rivers, to restrict Viking maneuverability and channel the opposing forces into favorable lines of engagement. Chronicle entries suggest that the army's disciplined formation and the use of prepared defensive positions played a significant role in controlling the battle's dynamics. Viking forces under leaders such as Guthrum were experienced, highly mobile, and capable of sustained campaigning. Their objective extended beyond immediate territorial gain, encompassing resource extraction and consolidation of strategic settlements. Archaeological findings, including weapon concentrations and temporary campsites near the battlefield, indicate a structured and logistically supported force. Alfred's strategic approach did not seek annihilation but aimed to disrupt operational momentum and compel Viking leadership to negotiate within defined geographic constraints. Following the battle, Alfred secured the surrender of Guthrum and his forces, formalized through subsequent oaths and agreements recorded in later sources. This marked a transition from kinetic warfare to negotiated containment. The terms required Viking forces to accept boundaries delineating Wessex and areas under Viking control, enforce compliance with tribute obligations, and commit to conversion to Christianity as a political and symbolic mechanism. These measures emphasize stabilization over destruction, allowing Alfred to manage risk while consolidating Wessex's position. The strategic outcome of Edington demonstrates the integration of military, political, and legal instruments. Military victory provided leverage, but the lasting effect derived from systematic enforcement of territorial limits and agreements. Alfred's use of oaths and religiously framed obligations reinforced compliance, creating a durable framework for coexistence with Scandinavian settlers. Contemporary chronicles note the significance of this approach in maintaining long-term peace and reducing the likelihood of immediate renewed incursions into Wessex. Operational planning also extended to post-battle settlement patterns and resource control. Alfred retained oversight of strategic locations, including fortified buzz, river crossings, and key urban centers. This ensured that the Viking forces could not exploit gaps in defense while adhering to the negotiated boundaries. Archaeological evidence supports the sustained presence of Wessex garrisons and fortified settlements following the battle, consistent with the strategic containment model rather than complete battlefield annihilation. The engagement at Edington also reflects a broader pattern of pragmatic military thinking. Alfred's reforms, including rotational levies, integrated fortifications, and centralized command coordination, directly facilitated the ability to contain a superior mobile force. By emphasizing operational control, supply security, and strategic positioning, Wessex could impose limits on Viking expansion without overextending its own resources or risking destabilization of domestic authority. By the conclusion of Edington, Alfred had successfully halted Viking momentum in southern England while leaving the broader structure of the Danelaw intact. The battle illustrates that military engagement, when combined with legal agreements and institutional reform, can achieve durable outcomes without requiring total destruction of adversaries. Containment, negotiation, and enforcement became as critical to Wessex's survival as battlefield performance. Coalitions fracture without purpose. The period following Alfred's stabilization of Wessex and the formalization of the Danelaw was marked by significant leadership transitions among the Viking settlers in England. Key figures of the Great Heathen Army, including Guthrum, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and other prominent chieftains, gradually died or returned to Scandinavia. Contemporary sources, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and later Norse genealogical accounts, document these changes, noting that their absence disrupted the previously unified coalition structure. The tightly coordinated campaigns that had defined the Great Heathen Army gave way to dispersed and locally oriented leadership, altering both strategic priorities and administrative oversight. The death or departure of central leaders created an environment in which smaller warbands and individual chieftains exercised authority over specific territories. These figures often lacked the capacity or incentive to maintain cohesive strategic direction beyond immediate settlement management or tribute collection. Archaeological evidence, including settlement patterns and variation in burial practices, indicates regional differentiation in governance, with local Scandinavian leaders asserting control over smaller populations while integrating with existing Anglo-Saxon administrative structures. This decentralization marked a shift from expeditionary coalition to territorial administration. Political fragmentation had direct implications for military organization. Large-scale coordinated campaigns, characteristic of the Great Heathen Army, became increasingly rare. Instead, forces were maintained primarily for local enforcement, dispute resolution, and defense against internal and external challengers. Numismatic and charter evidence demonstrates that taxation, tribute, and property control were administered regionally, reflecting the absence of centralized oversight. These patterns underscore that leadership loss directly influenced both the operational and structural coherence of Viking power in England. The decentralization process was also shaped by negotiation and accommodation with local populations. As coalition authority weakened, Scandinavian settlers increasingly relied on hybrid governance systems, blending Viking custom with Anglo-Saxon legal frameworks and administrative practices. In assemblies, local councils, and codified obligations were maintained at the community level, ensuring continuity of order despite the absence of overarching leadership. This localized governance created durable, though regionally distinct, political entities within the Danelaw. Social and economic structures were similarly affected. Wealth extraction, previously coordinated across multiple territories, became localized, with chieftains overseeing tribute and resource management within their specific domains. Settlement expansion was guided by pragmatic considerations, fertile land, river access, and defensible positions, rather than a centralized campaign plan. Archaeological surveys revealed differentiated settlement hierarchies, suggesting that authority was exerted variably, with some regions maintaining strong control while others exhibited more fluid population dynamics. This uneven consolidation reflects the structural consequences of leadership attrition. The fragmentation of Viking authority also influenced relations with Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Smaller, independent Scandinavian rulers often engaged in treaties, alliances, or localized conflict with neighboring Anglo-Saxon lords. Such arrangements reinforced territorial stability in some areas while permitting intermittent raiding or border disputes in others. Written sources indicate that coordination with Wessex and other southern kingdoms increasingly relied on negotiation and treaty enforcement rather than military imposition, highlighting the shift from expansionary operations to territorial administration. By the late 9th century, the original cohesion of the Great Heathen Army had largely dissipated. Leadership losses, internal rivalries, and logistical constraints transformed a once mobile coalition into a constellation of semi-autonomous territories. This transformation demonstrates how strategic objectives and operational capacity are contingent upon both individual leaders and the organizational framework they maintain. Without centralized coordination, the political and military unity that enabled rapid conquest was unsustainable over extended periods. The army ended without a final defeat. By the late 880s, the Great Heathen Army, once a highly coordinated force capable of sustained campaigns across multiple Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, had ceased to function as a unified military entity. Contemporary sources, particularly the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, record the gradual disappearance of coordinated operations, noting that raiding and territorial enforcement became the responsibility of localized Viking leaders. Unlike traditional armies that disband following a decisive battlefield loss, the Great Heathen Army dissolved through structural and political processes, illustrating the dependence of military cohesion on leadership and coalition purpose. The death, departure, or settlement of key commanders fundamentally altered operational capability. Leaders who had coordinated strategy, directed logistics, and enforced discipline were no longer present to maintain collective action. Remaining forces fragmented into regional warbands and garrison units, each accountable primarily to local objectives rather than overarching conquest. Archaeological evidence, including the distribution of settlement sites and weapon deposits, supports the emergence of decentralized Viking presence, reflecting dispersed authority and localized control rather than strategic campaigning. Internal rivalries further undermined cohesion. Dynastic disputes, competition over land, and disagreements regarding tribute distribution weakened the links between warbands. Written records suggest that some leaders returned to Scandinavia, while others sought independent power bases within the Danelaw. Without a centralized command structure, coordination of multi-regional campaigns became impractical, and the army's capacity for rapid redeployment and large-scale offensive operations effectively ceased. This fragmentation underscores the extent to which organizational integrity, rather than battlefield outcome alone, determines military longevity. The logistical implications of decentralization were significant. Sustaining a large, mobile force requires coordinated supply chains, communication, and resource allocation. As warbands became semi-autonomous, each relied on local provisioning and agricultural production rather than pooled resources. Settlement patterns in East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria indicate that Viking populations shifted from expeditionary encampments to more permanent occupation sites. This transition reflects both necessity and opportunity. Dispersed forces could not operate collectively, but local administration provided stability, economic control, and defense against Anglo-Saxon retaliation. Strategic objectives also evolved in response to decentralization. The army's original purpose, large-scale territorial conquest and control, was replaced by localized governance, tribute collection, and defensive maintenance. Evidence from charters and law codes demonstrates that Scandinavian leaders began to function as territorial lords, integrating into existing Anglo-Saxon political and legal frameworks. Military operations were therefore reactive and constrained, conducted primarily to enforce authority, secure economic resources, or respond to immediate threats, rather than to pursue a unified expansionist agenda. External pressures accelerated the army's structural dissolution. Alfred of Wessex's ongoing reforms, fortified Buzz, and organized levies imposed constraints on Viking mobility and operational reach. Repeated engagements, such as skirmishes along Wessex borders, drained manpower and reinforced the need for local defense over coordinated campaigns. Simultaneously, environmental factors, resource limits, and demographic pressures influenced settlement and military priorities, favoring sustainable territorial control rather than expeditionary warfare. The loss of strategic unity did not equate to the end of Scandinavian influence in England. Settlements persisted, legal and administrative structures of the Danelaw endured, and local warbands continued to exert authority in northern and eastern regions. The transformation from a coordinated army into a constellation of autonomous territories illustrates that dissolution was systemic, driven by leadership attrition, decentralization, and environmental and political pressures, rather than by a conclusive battlefield defeat. By the end of this phase, the Great Heathen Army existed only as a historical construct. Its former members had either integrated into the Danelaw, returned to Scandinavia, or assumed independent leadership over local territories. Strategic coherence, the defining feature of the army's earlier campaigns, was irretrievably lost. The operational template that had enabled rapid conquest and coordinated raiding no longer existed, leaving behind a network of settlements, governance systems, and enduring Scandinavian cultural influence across England. England was forged in response. The campaigns of the Great Heathen Army had a lasting effect on the political evolution of England. The sustained pressure of Viking incursions exposed structural weaknesses in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, prompting reforms that ultimately accelerated centralization and state formation. The responses of Wessex under Alfred the Great and his successors illustrate how sustained external threat can catalyze institutional development. Administrative innovations, military restructuring, and legal codification emerged not as abstract reforms, but as direct responses to the vulnerabilities revealed by the Viking presence. Alfred's Basystem and reorganized FYRD, initially designed to counter the Great Heathen Army, became foundational elements of centralized authority. Fortified settlements, strategically distributed across Wessex, integrated military, administrative, and economic functions. These buzz served as nodes of governance, enabling efficient taxation, coordinated defense, and oversight of local communities. The systematic implementation of these structures allowed Wessex to project power beyond the immediate vicinity of the royal court, setting a precedent for future English state organization. Legal reforms also contributed to centralization. Alfred's codification of laws combined inherited Anglo-Saxon codes with new statutes addressing both internal order and the challenges posed by Scandinavian settlers. Written charters and standardized legal processes reduced arbitrariness in governance and reinforced royal authority. By formalizing obligations and rights, the monarchy could manage both urban and rural populations more effectively, integrating previously semi-autonomous regions into a coherent political framework. These measures strengthened legitimacy and allowed for sustained enforcement of royal policy. The Viking threat also accelerated coordination among Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Although initially fragmented, Wessex, Mercia, and other polities increasingly engaged in diplomatic, military, and economic cooperation to resist further incursions. The Treaty of Wedmore and subsequent agreements illustrate how negotiated boundaries and defined spheres of influence emerged from the interplay between military pressure and institutional capability. These arrangements contributed to the eventual political unification of England under a single monarchy, as shared external threat highlighted the benefits of centralized coordination. Military innovations had lasting structural impact as well. The semi-professional levy system allowed for rapid mobilization without undermining agricultural production, while standing garrisons at Buzz ensured consistent defensive readiness. Coordination between local lords and the monarchy established hierarchies that persisted beyond Alfred's reign. The organizational principles implemented in response to Viking activity provided a template for subsequent monarchs, enabling the integration of distant territories under a single authority and reinforcing territorial cohesion. Territorial consolidation following the Viking settlements also influenced administrative geography. Regions formerly under fragmented or contested control were absorbed into structured systems of governance, often retaining Scandinavian populations under regulated oversight. This integration of conquered or settled territories reinforced the notion of state authority as both coercive and administrative, balancing local autonomy with central oversight. Over time, these arrangements contributed to the political and fiscal unification of England, creating the foundation for medieval English governance. The consequences of the Great Heathen Army extended beyond immediate defense and administration. By exposing structural vulnerabilities, the army catalyzed reforms in governance, law, and military organization. Alfred and his successors leveraged these lessons to create systems capable of withstanding external pressure, reducing reliance on temporary levies, and standardizing enforcement of authority. The transformation demonstrates that military challenge can accelerate institutional evolution, producing durable structures that outlast the original threat. By the end of the 9th century, the political landscape of England had been fundamentally altered. The experience of resisting the Great Heathen Army fostered centralized authority, codified law, and systematic military organization. England's eventual unification, while complex and gradual, was shaped in large part by the need to respond effectively to Viking incursions. The legacy of the army thus resides not only in Scandinavian settlement but in the institutional structures and strategic practices that define the emerging English state. Before you drift further into history, hit subscribe to join the Nightfall History community. Click the bell icon to receive daily videos exploring the rise and fall of empires, legendary armies, and the untold stories of our past. If today's journey through the Great Heathen Army intrigued you, leave a comment with your favorite moment. Your insights help bring history alive.